there. Oh, sorry about that. Now we're ready to go. We've configured the blinds, got the lights on, and now it doesn't matter because we're going to share a presentation, and so you're going to suffer death by PowerPoint. That's the way forward. Well done, sort of signing up for the long haul. This is the first one. We're going to tell you a little bit about sort of the shapes and the bits of seaweeds. So when we talk about them from an ID perspective later on, it'll make a bit more sense. And you can spot where we sort of swap words and get confused. Like a lot of things, the Victorians did it better. They loved collecting things, and seaweed was super popular because at the time scuba wasn't practical, and seaweeds are quite easy to enjoy from the shore. They did some absolutely sort of beautiful pressings. Oh, there's Inga. They did some absolutely beautiful pressings, and not only would they do these sort of wonderful example sheets, actually sort of herbarium collections, but also they do a bit of art, which was sort of combining pressings to form sort of cornucopias or even scenes. Unfortunately, when I Googled for some images of those, I didn't find them, although I've seen them in the past. And there's some really sort of lovely landscapes made up of different colours of seaweed. Seaweed presses really nicely, and I think probably what we'll do is we'll save the pressing bit, which is just a baby piece, right until the end.
That seems like a good idea.
It'll be light relief.
Mm.
Okay, so seaweed was nice, is nice, and you can still do great things with it. I think the two on the left are fairly contemporary, sort of multiple pressings of different species. So you can see you can combine the reds and greens and browns, which I'll explain in a bit, to build up just some really nice collages. And the amazing piece on the right is a fairly new resin encapsulated. I think it's resin encapsulated rather than pressed in glass. It might be a glass sheet with resin encapsulated seaweeds on the back at the Natural History Museum. And if you go to their new strange egg pod at the back of the building, that's in there. Or it must be on the way in, because you can see oldie style brickwork, and the pod is some kind of sort of alien spaceship which is dropped into the back of the building. Oh, there are people installing it to give you an idea of just how big the thing is. I reckon they've moved it since, because I'm sure we saw it. We didn't see it there.
No, it was on the going in door of the room we do courses in.
Yes, and that doesn't look like that either, does it?
Well, that's outside. They're just taking it through. So it's probably where it was leaning against the wall, waiting to go in.
It could be to me. It looks anyway. Yeah. We digress. It's not there anymore. It's inside.
But it is near the cocoon.
Near the cocoon. Good point. Our interest was piqued, and
is that a message or a person on the end?
I'm sure that's a chat coming in.
Okay.
Our interest was particularly piqued. Oh, Wendy asks, have these pressings been done by you? I don't think any of those were done by us. They were examples from just a Google image search of really nice pressings. We've done example pressings. We have held a few pressing days and tried to persuade people to do art, but you always run out of time. So I think getting across the basic method for an example is the main thing, and then people can take all the time in the world at home building stuff up, because it's pretty fiddly. So if you're working, I guess, with a delicate floaty seaweed and a big thick seaweed and a really sort of greasy jelly-like seaweed, it's going to take a while to get them to behave. Anyway, our seaweed interest really picked up, probably really in truth, in 2010. So I went down to the Scillies, met the lady in the cardigan on the left, who's Juliet Brodie, who's one of the curators at the Natural History Museum, and realised that we didn't really have much of a record for the East Coast. We then did a road trip up the East Coast in 2011, which is 9 years ago now, and since nothing's going to happen this year, it may be that next year makes real sense to try to sort of repeat that and see if anything's changed. So perhaps we'll do Seaweed East 21. So Juliet wrote us this nice foreword to a book of the pressings that we did do. And she made the point that the East Coast isn't the obvious choice for a survey. And I think all the British coasts could say that to an extent, because in a world context, the UK is not thought of as a diving destination, really. And then around the UK, each of the coasts is kind of neglected in one way or another. And I'd have thought Wendy from the northwest probably hasn't had nearly enough diving. If you're in Scotland, you've got some fantastic stuff, but we found, I think a lot of it's more seasonal than we're used to. And so we haven't really explored Scotland's seaweeds. Anyway, Juliet makes the point that Britain has around 7% of the world's known species, and that amounts to about 600 or so species, probably actually quite a lot more. The oldest collections are 300 years old, and the pressed collections are a viable source of expert ID and DNA.
Yes.
And actually DNA. So you can do amazing stuff with a bit of paper and some seaweed. Unlike the other phyla, where there's a whole lot of gilt and a lot of technical expertise required, seaweed is pretty simple. It's a nice, simple artisan process, and it's also beautiful as well. So when we did our Seaweed East survey, we ran from Essex and tried to get to Scotland, but the weather derailed us around Northumbria. Northumberland, quite true. And although we did some shore collections there, we didn't get to dive the farms, which was a bit of a shame, although we did go out on the boat and everybody got a bit sick.
Very sick.
So that was good fun. There were about a dozen of us. We spent, I think, 11 days in the end on the road. We found nearly 360 species overall, and that included nearly 140 seaweeds. And there were some interesting ones there. We had a sponge expert, so we didn't restrict ourselves to seaweed, but the seaweed was a real sort of feature. And we were surprised at how excited people got. The samples were all pressed, and when our local museum service wasn't really capable of taking them because the Tories, basically, all the museum services are under a lot of pressure. The Natural History Museum volunteered to take them, and that's where that presentation picture came from. So, seaweed itself. Seaweed is algae, which isn't really a plant. Seaweed and algae can pretty much be used interchangeably. When we describe seaweeds to people, we often call them plants in comparison to the other animal groups and phyla. They're not truly plants. It's just an easy way of talking about them, and otherwise you get into all kinds of complicated discussions. Seaweed is split into three main groups by colour, and as our poor Arran people will have discovered, colour's not a consistent way to describe their distant differences, but thematically it's a good way. Those colours are based on having different photosynthetic materials. So the red and brown algae have different photosynthetic chemicals from the greens, which share chlorophyll with land plants. Dawn is wobbling her head. I think it's broadly okay. Seaweeds are similar to plants, and the greens and reds are usually included in the plant kingdom, although browns aren't anymore. The browns are really quite interesting and are quite different in, I guess, structural and physiological ways.
Reproduction, particularly.
They're very sexy. But try explaining that to people over the course of a weekend. It's just a complete mind-knobbing. It's simplest to consider them plant-like, but unlike typical plants, seaweeds are non-flowering. No flowers underwater. Seaweeds have a structure, and they're quite diverse in appearance, but most share a broadly similar sort of set of parts, and this is what we describe. If someone was talking about the apices of seaweed, it's the points. Instead of leaves, we often talk about blades. Instead of a stalk, we talk about a stipe. At the bottom, they don't have roots, they have a holdfast, and because they're submerged, the holdfast doesn't function like the roots of a plant. It's an anchor, it's not a feeding mechanism. On the left, you can see this particular one has a midrib, like a plant leaf, but that's the minority of seaweeds. Not many have a midrib. And you can see these two are clearly very different, but most of those parts are available. And sometimes the presence of a midrib or particular behavior or at the apices or on the stipe is the way you tell one seaweed from another. Here we've got another couple of examples, and you can see again, although very, very different, they have the same features. This one on the left, which is Bryopsis, has leaflets. So I think that is what you'd call little bits of a blade. Complicated, isn't it? Most people would know what you were talking about if you used plant terms, but if you want to have a chat with somebody in a pub and nobody knows what you're talking about, these are the terms you would use. Some of those features are especially important if you want to tell things apart. The holdfast, sort of the root-like attachment at the bottom, sometimes is the only difference between otherwise identical species. So we've got the example of discoid forkweed and clawed forkweed, which look pretty much identical aside from their base. So in a moment, I'll show you an unhelpful picture, which shows you why you need to look at the bottom. But if you're going to collect them and you want to ID them, you don't just pick the flower, you don't just pick the tips, you need to take the holdfast as well. Juliet, the lady in the cardigan, carries a special little knife. Some of us have enough fingernails to be able to remove a holdfast. Others just have to look on sadly, especially if you're in gloves. You can't really use your nails if you're in gloves. So it might need a knife to remove the holdfast from a rock if you want a positive ID. So this example is actually Polyides rotundus, but you can't tell that because you can't see the base. Just know that. That's just a sad fact. Other seaweeds have different or separate sexes, like some plants do. Often those are down to reproductive differences. So great pipweed and slender wortweed, which we get locally down here, only have pips on the females. There must be some kind of suggestive comment I can make about that, but I thought I was pushing my luck with the filth earlier on, so we'll move on. So it's worth looking at several examples in an area before selecting an example or making an ID, because you might be missing the pips or some other signal of identity. Also, your first choice might have been grazed or damaged, so you want to try to make sure you find a good, typical and intact example. So here we've got Gracilaria gracilis, and you can see why it's called slender grapeweed.
Slender wortweed.
Slender wortweed, because it's slender and it's got warts on.
But only when it's being sexy.
And it's a girl.
Yes.
So a non-sexy girl wouldn't have
anything.
It would have nout.
Aye. As would a man.
Indeed. And that wouldn't be helpful at all. And then you couldn't even tell it apart from the other species. As I mentioned before, colour is not always a great way to tell things apart either. Red algae in particular can get bleached by the sun, and Irish moss, Chondrus crispus, can bleach to a bright yellow-green, or be red, very dark red, or a mid-green, or a brown. And so you want to find an example most closely representing the true colour, and you might need to select one from lower growth, which wasn't bleached, or growing on the shaded side of a rock pool. And one probably that wasn't too old, because then it would have become a bit woody and dark. So this is Chondrus crispus. What colour is Chondrus crispus, Dawn?
In theory, it is red.
What about this one?
Now, they are both Chondrus crispus. One's been slightly bleached and the other one's been very bleached. But they're both healthy and happy. It's just their reaction to bright sunlight.
Yes, so this is just a challenge for you. The seaweed's happy, and now you're confused. But these are both Chondrus crispus, Irish moss.
And it also has a variety of shapes as well as colours. It's a complete pain, that one.
Depending on the amount of wave action, local current, I guess length of season, intensity of light, it can grow in different forms as well. And, I'd have told you some more, but that's the end of the first presentation. So
that came quite quickly.
Yeah. Okay. So next one up is we're going to talk about the whole ID. This is the main bit, so this is a good chance for a bit of sleep at the very least. Okay, so if you're identifying seaweeds, there's a lot of them, and we're not going to teach you about every seaweed in the world. What we're going to try to do is run through some typical examples, and we'll mention others as we go along. And what I found, because I'm not great on seaweeds, is what you want to do is build up some seaweeds in each group that you know, and then you can eliminate those from the groups you see, and then you'll start seeing extra ones. So that's what I did, to try to build up a vocabulary of seaweed so that I could spot new ones and gradually add to it, because particularly the reds, there's a lot that look really quite similar.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like I said, this is macroalgae, biggish algae. They're not true plants, but they photosynthesize. Worldwide, there's around 12,000 species, so the percentage thing doesn't really work, but it probably meant that Juliet had found some more. So 600-ish, quite a lot of browns, not so many greens. I think the territory for greens is, I guess, lacking.
Quite small.
It's a small range. The greens like, I guess, sort of, for the most part, surface levels of light that puts them into the surf and wave action zone.
And they don't like that either.
And which they don't like. So they're the least numerous, and then the reds are most numerous. I guess they're the most specialized in that they have a different mechanism for photosynthesizing, which gives them a greater depth range they can operate in. And we've got some cute diagrams stolen from the Sea Search course. And you can see when they are brown, green, and red, it makes sense. But those are just nice examples. This chart and most of the presentation was stolen from Charmaine, who runs Sea Search in Ireland. So many thanks to her. And she found this diagram. And you can see there that we've got kelp, which are brown, reds, and then we go deep enough, we get to a point where there's not enough light for seaweeds. And you go, where were the greens? They're in the brown zone. So the browns, which can go a bit deeper than the greens, most greens, fight it out. And since the browns are tough, they can generally cope with most coasts, whereas the greens have to find niches. If you're looking to identify something, then there's lots of factors can have an influence. Color, he said portentously, which is a challenge.
There's an actual color as well as the color it should be.
Good point, because the color ranges within the groups can be quite a challenge. Textures, some seaweeds have a distinctive texture, some develop variable textures through the year or as they reproduce. Most are quite variable in form, depending on the amount of current, wave action, light, damage, length of life. And then there's things like branching pattern, formation of a holdfast, and their location, which affects everything else. So we'll start with some big ones, and hopefully everybody loves kelp. I know Pete doesn't, but he's muted, so I don't have to hear him
Oi.
fretting.
Get back in your box.
Yes. The nice big kelps grow up at the top, and they're the deco-stop seaweeds, especially if you go somewhere like the Farns, where you'll find yourself on your stop, sloshing around amongst the seaweeds, suffering from that uneasy feeling as the seabed just seems to be a conveyor belt. That said, there's a lot of life in amongst the kelp. So on the left-hand side, you can see Laminaria hyperborea, forest kelp. Because it's got a rough stipe, that big stem underneath, it gets covered with animals and other seaweeds. So it is a habitat. It's a great place, and it's an important part of the ecosystem. On the left, we've got we've got Laminaria digitata, which pretty much looks the same, but has a smooth stipe. And because it can be exposed, it's bendy. Forest kelp is stiff, so it grows that little bit deeper. It doesn't like to be allowed to fold over. It doesn't allow for it, so it would break, whereas Laminaria digitata is all bendy and can just collapse. Got some super big kelps like Dabbalox. This is quite shallow, sometimes wave exposed. Again, down in the east, we don't get these things. You don't get them on all sites anyway. But
I'm just going to say, we do get an invasive one that looks very much like this, which is from Japan, called wakami. And at the minute, that's just in marinas and on pontoons.
yeah, it looks as though it's come in. And one of the reasons it hangs around in marinas and on pontoons is pontoons stay close to the surface all the time. Our local conditions don't clear until the summer. And this means you don't get many big perennial seaweeds. They don't survive, but invasive seaweeds can cling to pontoons, and because they go up and down with the surface, they maintain a light input which can keep bigger seaweeds alive. Here we've got sugar kelp. This is Saccharina latissima, and up in Scotland we see some massive pieces of this, maybe 3-4 meters long. But weirdly, we see some of the laminarias, just the normal kelp, that's also multiple meters long, because in some of the calm areas of Scotland, it's not, I guess, cropped off by the wave action, and it grows long like this one. So it's confusing. Again, you'd have to look at the holdfast to be absolutely sure. Here's Furbelows, and that's another kelp, so called because of this fantastic wiggly holdfast and the base of its stipe, which is a bit like a ruffled collar from the 70s.
With unusual round growths at the bottom.
Are they usually paired?
Yes, they are.
So paired, bumpy nodules.
Round growths, yes.
Yes.
But the ruffled bit is to allow it to flop from side to side as the water goes up and down. So it's more like a hinge, really.
Yeah, much as Jason King would have done on television in the 70s. Now, some racks. So the kelps are the biggest seaweeds. The racks are all pretty big, really, and they hang around in this tough zone. They'll form ground cover on quite a lot of tidal coasts. We get a lot of it in the east. Lots of the calm Scottish sites have fantastic amounts, and this is an example probably from Loch Duick. And this is bladderwrack, so named. Why is it so named, Dawn?
Because it has 2 bladders either side of the midrib all the way up.
Yeah, so it's got a midrib and it has paired bladders. Very cute. And talking of paired bladders, here's Chris. So he's swimming in amongst some bladderwrack. I think that's Loch Duick as well.
And the bladders are full of, well, not air, I suppose, they're full of gas. So that when the tide comes in, the plant floats upwards and stands upright in the deeper water, so it can still keep photosynthesizing.
Yeah, so it keeps it close to the surface. So this is a difference between the seaweeds and plants, in that plants have to put in a lot of effort to hold themselves up. Seaweeds don't. Sort of much of their weight would be taken by the water anyway, but if they want to gain elevation so they can photosynthesize better closer to the surface, all they need is a bit of gas. Also reminds me of Chris.
Yep.
Okay, here's serrated wrack. You can all see why it's called serrated wrack, so I won't force Dawn to tell you the obvious. You can see in shape and size, it's very, very similar to bladder wrack, only it's shorter bladders. It's still got a midrib, it's got a saw-like edge either side, and the example on the right is bumpy with sauciness. This is a sexy seaweed, hoping to get it on, as far as a seaweed can. And so this is a seasonal change. And when it feels like reproducing, it goes bumpy. And this is quite common on seaweeds, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I was also going to say that serrated wrack is often found sort of higher up the beach or in water which is shallower, so it doesn't need the bladders quite so much, and it's more of a stiff kind of thing. It can almost hold itself up.
Yeah, I haven't included spiral wrack.
Michael's favourite.
Yeah, because I think, unfortunately, it falls into a difficult category where dried bladder wrack can look like spiral wrack, twisted serrated wrack can look like spiral wrack. So again, you'd be looking for a pristine example of it. It's not as clear cut as the other two, really.
It doesn't have really good identifying features.
But egg wrack does.
Oh, it does. I love egg wrack.
Yeah, and I think the egg wrack, Ascophyllum nodosum, is just spectacular around a lot of the sea locks. Again, I think this is Loch Duick. Luckily, Chris had moved on, so I could just satisfy my lust for seaweed. Egg wrack is, I think, the biggest of the wracks.
It certainly seems to get the tallest, doesn't it? We see it maybe 10 feet tall.
Yeah, and this is perhaps because it grows for a long while. I'm not 100% convinced, but we're always told by seaweedy people that it grows one bladder a year, which seems broadly consistent, but some of the stands of this stuff we see are so pristine, it doesn't look like they're that old.
No, but then they're in very sheltered water, aren't they? And it's covered in mucus, so nothing really grows on it much. But so if it's 10 feet tall, it could have about 20, 30 bladders in that height, couldn't it?
Yes, I mean, you can see even the clusters here look like this is a couple of 2-3 years growth. I mean, if you were looking at it as you're swimming through it, one of the cutest things is these bunny's ears on the top. So these grow very dense. It's the stuff you struggle to get through at the top of a lot of Scottish dive sites, particularly at low tide.
Yep.
You just find you're beaching yourself on this stuff. Okay, now we're into just brown algae. It's not really grouped beyond that, is it?
No, there's so many different little individual pieces of stuff. I mean, there are 3 Desmorestrias, to be fair. We only talk about one here.
Yeah, all I mean is the browns are then treated as a group. We've done kelps, we've done wracks, but then you're onto brown seaweed.
Yeah.
The reds are sometimes broken up into filamentous and foliose, so stringy and leafy, but the browns are just a big pile of browns. So Desmoestria has a fantastic pair of names, witch's hair or landlady's wig. You can see it's quite a fine brown, again, often seen in Scotland, that kind of sort of western Atlantic coast. What's the interesting thing about Desmoestria, Dawn?
It gives off sulfuric acid if you break it or upset it in any way. So if you were to collect this, if you're going around making up a nice little bag of different samples and you put it in the bag with the others, when you got back, the others would be mostly dissolved. So best not to store it with other things. But what it can also do is you can lay the whole plant out on a nice rock or something, and it will bleach the pattern to the rock. And then you can have that as a decorative thing around your garden.
Excellent craft tips, Dawn. Thank you. Yeah, so that's an interesting one, but one to avoid if you're collecting for pressing or to separate.
Yes, I usually carry a separate bag for desmorestes.
Okay, here are some thin browns.
That's fair.
Yeah. Okay, we've got Cordophyllum, which is really just a single string, just a single thin brown string. Makes for a fun pressing because you do a big spiral with it. Because it can be several meters long, if you wanted to do it in a line, knock yourself out. But it's going to be episodic because you rarely get paper like that. It's very similar in appearance to Hymenthalia elongata, which also sounds like it's quite long. But that's called thongweed, which causes all kinds of descriptive difficulties. Essentially, Cordophyllum is a single bootlace, whereas Hymenthalia elongata splits close to the bottom from one base stipe into two long stringy blades. The name thongweed comes from the way that a flip-flop would split between your toes, but presumably that's the Australian version, whereas I think you could still understand it as thongweed, even from the English definition of that. You can see that at the bottom, it's got little buttons that almost look like tiny lily leaves, and they're the size of sort of a penny. Oh, Wendy says you can cook thongweed and use it as spaghetti.
No, thanks.
I don't see why you wouldn't want to cook a thong, particularly in these lockdown times of pasta shortage. That's quite the idea.
That's true.
We don't get enough of it round here to really make up even a pot noodle.
No, we hardly ever see it.
But that's a great idea for
when we're desperate in the van in
for
Scotland.
bus travel in Scotland,
yes.
Isn't it? There's loads of it off the Appin lay-by dive,
yes,
which we did last year. Helydris silicosa is called sea oak or podweed. Annoyingly, it's one of two seaweeds that are often called sea oak. That's why we try to coach you not to talk about things exclusively in their sort of common or colloquial names. But podweed makes a bit of sense because the stuff has pods. It looks rather like a rack.
I think it is a rack, in fact. I'm not sure why it's separated out. It always is. It's not just that we've done it.
Yes, well, it's probably my stupidity in this case, but it would have made a logical progression because the scale of the plant is sort of rack-like, isn't it? It's sort of a bit taller often than bladderwrack.
Well, with us, it's about 2.5 feet high for a good one. But if you go down to the south coast off Dorset, it can be about 6-8 feet high. I don't know why it's better. I suppose it gets more light and things.
Yeah, it's vigorous stuff, it's invasive, and it's progressing. So in areas where it can outcompete, it turns up in quantities and thrives. We get quite a lot of this off some of our sites, like the Runtons have quite a lot of this. They're particularly shallow, good sites for algae, and it seems to be sort of tough and exists perhaps a bit lower than the racks do.
Definitely does. But it's only appeared with us in the last few years, hasn't it? We never used to see it at all.
Insignificant quantities, and I think this is the problem with invasive things. They can sneak in because they're not a big... Not invasive. Sorry, not invasive. Forget that.
But it's one that's coming with the temperature changing, I think.
Yeah, so it's it's arrived here. I misspoke. Forgive me, please.
Very well.
We find stalk jellies on these. And last year they were on everything, but in previous years we've only found them on this for some reason. Dictyota dichotoma.
Very good.
I've been practicing since my foul up in the observer course. So not Dictyota, not named after the car. So dichotoma is because this branches and branches and branches again, each time splitting in two. This is a rather nice example where it's very finely branched, and you can see how sort of sweet and small it is, and how at every joint it sort of halves in width. It's really very tidy. If we show you an in situ live piece, you can see, again, very smart. This is a sexy one here, and up at the top is one that's being left out.
And this is also a good example of how a thing changes depending on where it's growing. So I think that first one was from Essex, a very sheltered site where it grew long and stringy. And this one's up in Norfolk on a fairly exposed bit of the reef. So it's much more compact and rounded.
Yeah, something like straight out of Sheringham,
I reckon.
Yeah. And for a while we were confused with Thaonia atamaria, dotted peacock weed. So if I hopped back, if I could hop backwards, I'd say that Dictyota is pretty flat, smooth, almost bland, unless it's sexy. Whereas Thaonia has banding in it.
It always looks a bit manky, doesn't it? Like it's been beaten around or something.
Yeah. And look at its irregular branching.
It's all over the shop.
Yeah, and this one, the blade just has splits off one side, and some of those are split, some of those aren't. And the smaller piece has branched and then split, almost like pretend dichotoma, just not as neat, a bit tatty.
And the widths tend to be very random as well, don't they?
Yeah, so it's similar in appearance, and sometimes these both will feature on the same site. They'll almost grow in amongst each other. This is a bed of Thaonia. We get lots of this stuff. So in the shallows, maybe in 2 to 3 meters depth.
Down to about 7 or 8 in a good clear year.
Yeah, I think it just depends on the year and the site and what else is competing, how long the season has been. Oh, this is properly invasive.
Yes.
Yes, and it's another floating one. So Sargassum muticum, wireweed, Japanese weed. It's invasive and it's moving north and west with sort of, I guess, climate change and advance.
And boat travel.
Yeah, and I think these are probably Irish examples.
Yes.
And so you can see, compared with the diver, again, this is stuff that can grow several meters long, and it has little bobbles on, which means it can float. So it is ever so vigorous, and it can blanket out native seaweeds underneath it. So not really a benefit to a site. Now we're ready for some greens. Okay, first one we'll talk about is sea lettuce, Alva lactuca. It's one of the first greens I learnt, and I thought, great, I've learnt a seaweed. And then Juliet Brodie gave me a green seaweed book, and I was absolutely heartbroken to discover there's more than 60 of the things. Because Juliet's an expert, she can tell them apart by feel. And I think lactuca is quite stiff.
It's quite slippery. And it's a bit like tissue paper or something.
Has a definite feel to it.
Yes.
But there's one on the bottom right, you can see there are other green seaweeds that are a bit like it, and there are some that are hardly like it at all. Gutweed, how would you tell gutweed apart?
It's a tube rather than a flat sheet. So although there are about 60 kinds of ulva, most of them are a single flat sheet. I think gutweed is the only one that forms a tube. There may be one other.
Yeah. Why does it form a tube?
Why not?
Well, I think it isn't it so it can form its own gassy pockets.
Yes, that's true. It does do that. It does help it to float up in the water.
Yeah, so this, once pressed, you don't really get the full majesty of the whole thing. But because it's tubes, gas can collect as the plant respires, and it can float up, gain a bit of height.
Like a wacky waving arm man, because they're not sealed.
Yeah, so it will blow off through its tubes. I mentioned Bryopsis, and Bryopsis is an interesting green because it occurs really quite deep. How deep have we seen that?
We've seen it at 17, and that's off our coast.
Yeah, it goes down surprisingly deep. And it's a lovely little seaweed.
It's tiny.
Looks very nice. So I think it probably started off being some bolshy green and then just got bullied until it went deeper and deeper away from the more blankety green. So it doesn't occur in big fields, does it? It occurs in
No, you get little individuals.
little tufty growths.
And gets to about maybe 3-4 inches high for a really big one. But the really interesting thing about it is the whole plant, you might say, is a single cell. So when you try to press it, or if you puncture it, all the chloroplasts squirt out, so you often get a completely clear pressing, which is a bit disappointing.
Yes, we've got some disappointing pressings of it. So you have to be careful. Is this one you'd try to press in seaweed rather than normal water?
You mean seawater?
Seawater.
Yes, you're trying to avoid bursting the cells. So you would, well, we'll come to the pressing later. You would use seawater for this one to be as gentle as possible. So it's a bit like something like a balloon animal. It's like lots of tubes that have been twisted together, but it's one individual cell.
Yeah, so it's not so much like it's like a single balloon animal made of balloons that have been sort of carefully joined rather than twisted, so they're all continuous. So this one, although it's pressed flat and looks like a feather, has these leaflets all the way around.
Yeah, like a pointy blue brush kind of thing.
Yes. Whereas this one, which you can't tell, actually is like a feather. So it has sort of 2 rows of leaflets coming out either side.
Yeah, like a feather or a fern.
Yeah. It's not immediately obvious, it depends how you approach these things. So you can kind of see in this photo that it's like feathers.
So this is plumosa, just in 2 dimensions.
Yeah, plumose, like a feather, flat, like a feather. The other one's more bushy, as you say, like a bog brush. This is another green we see a lot. Again, this one forms bigger bushes, doesn't it?
It's big untidy green bush.
Yeah, and this is a really green seaweed. It's almost an embarrassingly green seaweed.
It's a bright emerald, isn't it?
Yes, that's a good word for it. It's very dense, really quite fluffy. Hard to get a nice pressing unless you thin it out. And then you're not really showing how it appears. So it's a tough decision. So this pressing reflects how it looks. And in place, you can see why it's hard to press. It's like a little bush. That example's probably getting on for 15 centimetres, 6 inches tall.
Yeah. And again, this is another difficult one, because I think there's about 5 different cladophoras, and they're all slightly different colours and slightly different sizes. So it needs an expert to say which one it really is. But this is the common one, so you're generally on safe ground.
Yeah, so we're not pretending to be experts. What we did in the 2011 trip was to bring some experts with us. They then needed to refer to other experts, but what it did was build us up a local herbarium, and then there are some excellent experts about. The Dorset coordinator, Lynn Baldock, is fearsomely good on seaweeds. She came with us on the trip, and her recommendation was, if you're interested in seaweeds and ID, build yourself up your own local herbarium, because your species may present differently locally. She identified all the pressings we made as far as she could, and then there were a few she wanted confirmed, and that's when we went to the Natural History Museum, presented the collection over, and also got another expert who happened to be based in Essex, but we met him in London, to go through the others with us. So it's not that we became expert enough to ID these on our own. It's we got expert advice, built up the herbarium, the collection of seaweeds, and now we can refer to those to help us with ID. And we also know what was present as well. Codium isn't one we get here, is it?
No, but we see it a lot in Scotland.
Yeah, so I've seen some lovely codium on the sides of Scottish Narrows.
Yes.
That seems to be particularly rich in it.
But I think the one there is, there's at least 3 kinds in this country, and I think that one is the invasive one.
Ooh.
It's funny stuff though. It's like a 3-dimensional thing made out of felt, isn't it? It's got a very strange texture to it.
Yes, it's like the sort of Sylvanian families people
Yes.
made a seaweed, and so it's floppy and thick. can pick up a bit of crud and looks really quite odd when you see it clean and for real, because it's a bit like sort of thick felted pipe cleaners or something.
And there's a kind of sea slug called Elysia that really loves to eat it, and it mostly sits inside the fronds. They're big and thick enough that it can sit inside, hollowing the thing out.
What a little scumbag.
Yeah.
Yeah. So up at the top, we're saying Codium sp, because we don't know exactly which one this is.
No. Apparently it's very difficult. You have to take a section of the tip and squash it on a microscope slide and then look at the cells.
There's quite a few seaweeds like that that are almost impossible to ID by sight. They need microscopic examination.
This one doesn't.
Nope. Excellent. So we're fully into the reds now. Caliblepharus ciliata, eyelash weed, fringe weed, beautiful eyelash weed. I think, again, if you want to sound cool in the pub, saying Caliblepharus ciliata is the way to go.
I'd say there is a similar one to this called Caliblepharus jubata. Generally speaking, the ciliata is found in the sea when you're diving, and jubata is intertidal. If you're rock pooling, you might find it.
Yeah, I think Wendy had posted a really nice example of it, where when we did a survey up our coast, there was some discussion about whether we'd found jubata or not. Our Caliblepharus is mostly big and meaty like this, but the example Wendy had was actually barely any blade and mostly tassel, which was interesting to see. This is another weed that can get sexy. So it can start off quite subtly tasseled, and then when it's in the mood, it's gone for it.
Or if it's received a lot of damage, because every time it takes a knock, it grows a spike.
Good point. So when ours grows in shallow wave-affected areas for the most part, in big clumps.
It's like a hedgehog by the end of the year, isn't it?
Yeah, so last year we had lots of stalk jellies in these. Ah, beautiful fanweed.
Yes.
Ah, beautiful fanweed. Caliophyllis laciniata. When the Sea Search seaweed book was written, a lot of these seaweeds didn't have common names, and the seaweed people, the phycologists, made the brave decision to go to the pub and make up a lot of new common names.
Which is why they're longer than the scientific names for the most part.
Which I think is probably a clever scientific ruse to get you to learn the Latin names, the scientific names, because sometimes they're shorter and more meaningful. Anyway, this is a lovely one. This isn't actually a stunning example of a pressing. These can look absolutely
Beautiful.
Fantastic.
Really bright sort of cerise pink, aren't they, as a pressing, and they're quite a dull red as a live thing.
Yes, they look better pressed than they do live almost. We don't get that, do we?
No, it's a northern thing.
No, I can tell by the accent. This is one we do get. Chondria dasyphylla, diamond cartilage weed, and that, I guess, kind of describes its feel. It's quite thick, quite stiff, and the diamond bit is sort of, you can see patterns in it if you look up close.
Yes, if you get a lens or a microscope and stick a single leaf under, it's got a really clear, like diamond patterned windows. What are they called?
Like leaded windows.
Yeah, like leaded windows, that sort of pattern. There's 3 chondrias, at least locally to us. I think there are only 3 generally. We get this one, and there's one that fluoresces, which is very, very pretty.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's one that's something like slender dasyphylla, which is quite boring.
Boo.
Oh, and the way to, sorry, oh, we can do it on this one. In fact, we'll do it on the next picture. The way to tell this underwater is the little individual side branches pinch in just as they join the main stem. So it's quite clear on this one. Again, a bit like twisted balloons.
Yeah, this is more like twisted balloons,
Yeah.
isn't it? All almost sausages. But you don't mention sausages because there are other things
there are
that are
many,
described
many
as
sausage
sausages.
weeds.
Yes. Oh, we really like this one.
Yeah, we're into town on
This one shows the pinching really well.
Oh, yeah.
And you've got a bonus osmundia.
Oh, yes. Because I don't think we mentioned that again.
We don't. You don't see it much, and we're not trying to fill your brains with too much stuff, although now we have.
But we should talk about it because it's the other one it's the one that kills people.
Oh, yes. So Osmundia is fun. If you are pressing this, this gives off a
poison gas, and I can't think what it is offhand. It might be one of those ones that sewage gives off, like hydrogen sulfide or something.
Yes, I think perhaps it is. I think it's odorless.
Yes.
And so when we put all our samples into one small car during the Seaweed East road trip, we had to make sure the person driving with the samples kept the windows open. So this is Decellaria sanguinea. You get sanguineas unhelpful, just means
red.
Bloody and red. Oh, another bloody red seaweed, perhaps. Sometimes called sea beech, because sometimes the leaves are quite like a beech leaf. They've got a distinct midrib and some side ribs,
Yes.
haven't they? So
That shows most clearly on the actual photo. You can see them really well there.
yes, it's quite distinct. I mean, it talks here about a smooth edge,
Yes.
and then shows an example that's fairly worn,
Yes, it takes damage really easily, which then does make it look quite ruffled.
which is annoying because
Yeah.
there's a similar weed which is also called sea oak. So we'll come on to that. Not yet, though. Dilcia carnosa, it's called red rags. And this, I think, is difficult to show in a photograph because a lot of the difference between it and other seaweeds is that it looks like a material for making something. It doesn't really look like a plant or a seaweed.
No, it's like thin floppy leather lying around on the seabed, isn't it? And it always looks shredded and damaged. I've never seen one that looked perfect. It always looks like somebody's just dumped something on the seabed.
Yeah, and I think from a land perspective, you expect to see plants growing regularly. So the brown ones like the Dictyota, Dichotoma, and the Theonia, they appear to, they come up from a base, they branch, and that seems normal. Whereas this is almost a sheet which splits as it covers something. And if you're collecting light, lying down flat, if you're a big flat plant, isn't such a weird thing to do. And it probably just gets its leaf stirred around. So this feature on the left, or the presentation on the left, isn't unusual. It looks like a big mess of damaged red leather. And that's a pretty big one. This is a large seaweed. The little example on the right is a little example of it. It's not a big example.
Somebody's managed to find a nice tidy baby one just coming up.
Yeah, and already it's started to split in a kind of improvised way. Here we've got Furcellaria lumbricalis. This was one of the forked weeds, and this is the one with the clawed base. And it looks as though, to me, this has been a real sod to get off the rock because it's got smashed up.
And it always has other things growing in amongst it as well. It is a complete pain to get off anything.
Yeah, our Polyoides rotundus grows in nice, dense little bushes, whereas this is a lot stringier, and that's probably down to the places it grows. And another one, this looks as though it's tricky to press.
Yes, it is, because as you'll see in the live picture coming up next, it's sort of, you get a basic plant that comes up, but then it loops away across the rock, and wherever it touches down, that's good, wherever it touches down, a new plant grows up and it sticks itself down with a new holdfast, so it makes thickets. So it's very, very difficult to pick out a nice piece to press. It's just a tangled mess, like a bramble. But it does make that sort of sausagey shape. You can see it's got lots of little pinches running down the stems.
Sausages.
This is supposed to be found only rarely around Devon and Cornwall, and we actually have it as one of our commonest species on the East Coast. But Francis Bunker, who writes the seaweed book, refuses to believe us. So he will not put it on the maps.
Yeah, there's a lot of Western bias or Southwestern bias. So if you're looking for seaweeds, having a pressing is great because it means you can tell people about the wacky examples you've found and then go, well, now account for this. And there we've got Gracilaria again. And I think this is a wartless version. So
Yes.
even the Natural History Museum weren't able to be certain that this was Gracilaria gracilis because it didn't have bobbles on.
Yes. And there's about 3 or 4 kinds of Gracilaria, and when they're not being sexy, it's almost impossible to tell them apart.
Yeah. Don't get confused either about this bottom bit. It was growing on a piece of Caliblepharus.
That's actually a particular species of parasitic weed that's growing up it.
Oh, sorry about that.
I can't remember what it's called. It should have been written on there, but it's not.
Okay.
It's just a brown or red fluff. It's not very interesting.
Okay, ignore my confusing comment. Ooh, and their sun is in full effect. So this is one of our local pictures of Gracilaria gracilis. I can't see any of the others we talked about so far, but this stuff is Placamium down at the front. Lots of delicious Placamium.
That's our most common and luxuriant seaweed, isn't it?
Yes, and here's a bit of a close-up so you can see your warts and all.
Okay. A message. Oh, thanks, Wendy. Wendy says it's beautiful.
I'm talking of beautiful. So this is called Heterosiphonia plumosa. This is a fine red, and the reds are broken up by types, but it's really only by sort of shape as much as anything.
Doesn't mean anything, does it? It's just a random way of breaking things up.
Yeah, but when the scientific name of a red seaweed mentions siphons, here is Heterosiphonia, you can tell that the stems have holes up them. And sometimes they are very characteristic. And the shape of this means it can be told apart. Some of them are pretty much plainly filamentous and are very hard to tell apart other than by counting the siphons. And if you imagine it's like sort of a bundle of hose pipes, or a bit like a cable of sort of twisted pipes.
Of different shapes and sizes.
Of different shapes and sizes, but particular numbers and particular arrangements. Then if you need to identify those, you'd cut a slice, a bit like you'd slice a carrot, and then stick that under a microscope, and you'd count your number of tubes, spot their shapes, and then that would tell you what species you were looking at. Luckily for us, this one is fairly easy to spot. That looks nicely fluffy.
And this has been taken from quite a silty site, so it's actually managed to collect loads of the silt within its feathery bits. Now, if you're going to press this, you'd really have to wash it out, otherwise you just get a big crunchy mess on the paper.
So this is seahorse tail, and you can see this is, similar thematically to the previous one, only distinctly randomly arranged. The other one's sort of nice conical arrangements, and this is all over the place.
Yeah, and the individual branches are shaped more like a horsetail on land would be, the green curly sorts of things. The little miniature versions of those.
Now, undertongue weed is one of the folios reds, and like we said, there's a lot of talk of sort of filamentous reds and juicy reds and folios, and folios just means it looks like it's got leaves.
Yeah.
And so it boils down to thin stuff, sausagey stuff, and leafy stuff.
This one's quite nice to be able to ID because it's got a very faint central midrib, and then at intervals along it, it's got these little paired patches which almost look like a deer's hoof print or something like that, little thickened pairs either side of the midrib, which is handy because with us in East Anglia, it never gets more than 1 inch or 2 high. It is tiny, whereas in other places it will be quite a big plant, sort of 6 inches or so, and very obvious.
Good tip.
Thanks, mate.
Glad you were here. This is dulse, and if anything, this is a typical red leafy weed, which we don't get.
No, we don't. And it always used to get mentioned a lot in the Observer course and was very prominent in the General ID Guide. So everybody thought they saw it everywhere because it was such a common thing, and we don't see it at all.
No, not that common. And while we go on about things not being common, this year was supposed to be the year when we sort of attacked some Scottish seaweeds, because I think the Scottish growing season is complicated like ours. The water's clear, but the light levels are lower because of the northern latitudes, and also you've got landscape. We don't have landscape down here. We're just flat. So when there's light, the sea gets it all. Whereas the days can be very short in Scotland down at the bottom of a loch or even in a valley. So the seaweed growth is very compressed to short depth ranges at the edges of lochs. And so we were going to try and have a concerted effort throughout the year to look at more seaweeds, which we haven't so far.
We aim to.
Yeah, maybe next year is the year this will all happen. At last, sea oak.
The other sea oak.
Yeah, so this one looks more oaky, and I think generally looks more oaky, but you can see that the sea beech looked pretty rough and lumpy as well.
I think the main difference with this, and I have only seen it in Scotland, we don't seem to get it, is this is a more transparent leaf with a bit of a shine to it, whereas the sea beech is more like an actual leaf. It's sort of quite rough and plain looking, isn't it?
I quite like the look of it, but
I like it much better.
Yeah.
This always looks a bit fleshy and creepy.
You've been creeped out by seaweed again.
Yeah.
Excellent. So Phycodrus rubens. I mean, lots of the names are quite catchy. And here we have Placamium.
Rob's favourite seaweed.
Again, it's a good pub name. Tragically, again, we used to be able to say, Placamium cartilaginum. But now we've pretty much established that even the experts can't tell its species apart. And you're supposed to be able to tell by the number of teeth on the combs, but they're very variable. They're too variable.
Yes, you have to count at least 20 on a plant and then work out what their range is. And there are 3 species and they all have overlapping ranges. So your chances of getting it are pretty slight.
Yeah, it's really very annoying, but it does press beautifully. It is a very nice looking seaweed, and it grows in big fluffy bushes. So if you don't like it, it's a bad thing. So better get used to it. That's the thing here. So this example has lost a lot of colour, but that's to make it a clearer example. It's usually a pretty nice bright mid-red.
Oh, it's almost over.
It's almost over. Well done. Well, we're still going to talk about the pressing things. I don't think you've escaped. But eelgrass isn't a seaweed.
No.
So eelgrass or seaweed is super popular because it's a habitat, and it's often a protected or specially considered habitat. It's where seahorses live, according to the seahorse people.
And according to anyone who wants you to do a course about eelgrass, they'll tell you there are seahorses in it.
Yeah, so it's reasonably easy to tell apart from seaweeds. It's very like grass.
It's vascular, it's full of veins.
Yeah, you can see them running up, and the particular kind of Zostra is easy to identify by counting the veins going up the leaves. And this one is Marina, which I think is the slightly deeper version.
Yes, it's the one that's generally subtidal and not intertidal.
Excellent. Seagrass is easily confused with marine macroalgae, say these learned people who I took this from. But there are important differences. Seagrasses are considered vascular plants, so they have a veiny, tubey system in them. which makes you wonder how they're differentiating this from the siphonic plants.
Because these are specialised veiny tubes. The siphonic plants are just a collection of straws. These have tubes that do different jobs.
Ah, excellent. Glad to hear they do jobs. So they also have, as well as the vascularity, they have roots, stems, leaves, and flowers. Although the flowers are pitifully small, the seaweeds don't have flowers. They reproduce by producing little pips and nubs and florets, and some of them even have swimming reproductive bodies. So seaweeds are cool. The Zostera is just a plant.
Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. Excellent. I think that's the main bit done. So well done staying with us. You've been very brave. Now, let me see if I can swap to another thing. Let me see if we can swap to the last one. I'm just dealing with how dreadfully confusing, oh, there it was the last one, my PC is being, and how having thousands of pop-up screens has prevented any of this being easy to operate. Okay, so now we'll move on to a bit of a chat about pressing. This really is very short. Even if you need a wee, you'd be able to survive to the end.
I need a wee.
They don't need to know that. I can't use it. The recording is useless. Anyway, so pressing seaweeds is as simple as it sounds. Well, I guess it's even actually simpler than it sounds. So seaweeds can be saved really well just by pressing them, and that's drying them on thick paper. The thick paper is so that the paper doesn't just collapse when it's wet. And so all you need is a tray, thick paper, nappy liners, and a drying press.
Or a big pile of books.
Well, that can be a drying press. It doesn't mean it has to be made of wood or anything exotic. And we'll talk about what the press actually needs to be in a moment, because the drying bit is more important than the pressing bit. A key thing is to label your samples using a pencil before you soak the paper. This is a rookie mistake, is once you've soaked the thing, you can't write on it. But if you write on it before you've soaked the paper, then they travel along forever together. So you do all the proper recorder things like name, date, location, and the species, or any guesses you've got, because otherwise you can't write it down until it's properly dry. So if you've got a shallow tray, like an inbox or a litter tray,
or a photographic
darkroom tray, any kind of tray, having it rectangular and paper shaped makes it easier. You could, in theory, use a plate, anything you liked, or the sink, but if it's shallow and flat bottomed and paper shaped, that's going to make life easier.
That one's a kitten's litter tray.
Ah, excellent. So you float your sample onto the paper. So you slip the paper in, you float the sample on, and then you spread it out to... Oh, Pete asks, would heavy lining paper be suitable?
I don't know.
I think so. I mean, you could use pretty much anything.
Yeah.
You can...
Sorry.
You could press onto heavy printer paper. So I think lining paper would be fine.
I would wet some and see what it does. Lots of kinds of paper go all wrinkly and awful when they get wet. And so just try it. If it doesn't go wrinkly, then it's perfect.
Excellent. Lining paper stands a good chance because it's made to lie flat.
Yeah, it's to be pasted and stuff, isn't it? So yeah, that should work. Yeah.
The paper Dawn uses is acid-free herbarium archive paper, which we get, oddly, from a supplier that's about 20 miles from us.
And it's the only supplier in the whole of Europe.
Yeah, very strange that. They're just nearby. That stuff is nice. And the acid-free bit is important because it doesn't attack the sample. I think, to be honest, once it's dry, the attacking is over.
Anyway.
And it also means it doesn't degrade over time. So it is an archive paper.
But like cartridge paper or watercolor paper is also good, because that's, especially the pre-stretched stuff, because that's meant to be made very wet as well.
Yes. So your mileage may vary. Try what you've got.
Oh, another one.
Ooh.
Ah,
Mark offers that lining paper isn't acid-free, it fades badly. So
well, that's handy to know.
well, it could be Chris, I suppose. It's from Mark and Chris. So thanks very much for that. Oh, I should have said that we talked there, and I highlighted there that ideally you'd use seawater for this.
Mm.
You can use fresh water for most seaweeds.
Yeah.
Tough seaweeds aren't affected too badly, but because of the way the chemical exchange, the osmotic pressure of the water that's within the sample, delicate things can be effectively exploded or burst.
Yeah.
But if you use seawater, you shouldn't suffer that. So if you've taken some seaweed samples, take a bit of seawater with you and you can use that in your tray. Here you see someone very skilled and enormously expert sliding the paper carefully out of the water and so raising it up so the leading edge of the seaweed is dried, it's beached, and then the seaweed pulls itself out as the rest of the paper is brought up. So you don't do a magician's sort of tablecloth trick because you're aiming to leave everything on the table as you've arranged it. Well, Wendy says, I have made seawater. 3 grams of salt to 100 millilitres of tap water. I think, Wendy, that's not going to solve the oceans drying out. But a useful idea.
That is handy to know.
Yeah, excellent. Here, that skilled seaweed presser has transformed one red seaweed into some brown seaweed, and it looks rather like that example of Dictyota dichotoma from earlier on. But if you aren't satisfied with the arrangement, you can use a paintbrush or a pencil or tweezers or a tip or your fingers. You can just slide it back in and it'll float off and you can do it again. So you don't have to worry that the whole thing is wrecked. You can just keep doing it again and again. This is a good activity for volunteers who won't shut up, children who won't shut up, relatives who won't shut up, or people who are interested in seaweed. We've done exercises and days, like I said, where it's been a mixture of people who are interested in things that have been collected from the beach, divers who want to know what they've seen, and people who are interested in producing art. It's really a very accessible way to record what you've seen. And I think that brings us
to the end.
To the end.
Yay!
You've survived really well. Thank you ever so much.
Oh, we've kept everybody.
Yeah, I think they've gone to sleep. That's where they've gone. So if anybody wanted to ask a question, you can either type it in or shout it out.
You'll need to unmute yourselves.
Oh, Penny made a noise.
Mm.
Were you going to say something about the actual pressing itself?
Oh, I was.
Oh,
it's good. I see. I told you she was our star pupil. Yeah,
that's been cut in half, hasn't it?
Yeah.
It's just lifting it out, and then there's nothing about pressing it.
Oh,
there's nappy liners and everything.
My fault. Yes. So you're quite right, Penny. For some reason, it should have said, okay, once you've lifted your pressing out, you would put a nappy liner over it, and that's to stop it sticking to the things you might put on top.
Yeah. And you'd put your piece of paper on something like folded newspaper that can start soaking the water out of it.
Yeah, so you're producing a sandwich to make a pressing. So put down something like newspaper underneath your paper. It doesn't need to be a lot of newspaper. Maybe a doubled over sheet.
Yeah.
2-3 sheets, a small amount of newspaper. Then your wet sample pressing, and then the nappy liner over the top, and then a piece of newspaper on top. Similar amount, not really a huge amount. And then the pressing is just to keep the newspaper in contact with your sample pressing.
To squash the water out.
Or to draw the water out. Yeah. If you wanted to do more pressings, then you just step and repeat another thing over that. So second piece of newspaper, another nappy liner, another piece of newspaper. And you can keep piling them up. By the time we came out of the Seaweed East trip, I think we had 300 pressings.
Yes.
And so it was a big, fat bundle of stuff. And I'd made pressing boards, which were just plywood, and I'd drilled a lot of sort of inch holes through it so that it could breathe. Because you're not trying to compress them. You're just holding the paper against the samples to draw the water out. And it doesn't just dry, especially if your sample stack is multiple inches thick. You have to change the newspaper every day.
At least once a day, every day, for at least a week or 10 days.
Yeah, and you'll be able to tell it's dry because you'll have visited them daily for a week. And the first few days are absolutely critical. They'll then dry more slowly, but you still need to make sure they're completely dry. Otherwise, you'll just have a lot of mold, a lot of moldy pieces of paper. Once they're properly dry, then I think normally we stack them up. You can get rid of the newspaper, but we leave the nappy liners on them
As protection.
As protection from the sheets above. And the nappy liners, I didn't know this because we don't do that kind of thing, but to stop one thing sticking to another thing, but yet they allow the moisture to pass through. I don't know how they got their name. Excellent. So excellent question, Penny. And so pressing is nice and easy. It's a bit labor intensive if you've got lots of samples around. If you can leave them out level finally, then normally after a week of pressing and changing the papers, we leave them to air dry. And usually by that time they've stuck down pretty well. And then once they've perhaps had another week of that, or you're happy they're dry, you then stack them up and you've got your own herbarium.
That's done.
Excellent. So good question, Penny. Anybody else?
Oh, they're all dead.
Ooh.
Hi, Rob. Really good talk once again. Very entertaining. Thank you. I was really interested to hear a little bit more about the reproductive differences between the brown seaweeds and the green and reds.
Okay.
Damn you, sir.
Okay. Well, you are pushing at the limit of our expertise, and probably slightly beyond it. I think there's still debate about how these things are classified. For a long while, they were perhaps considered to be within the plant kingdom, and then they were divided out into sort of separate phyla.
Well, the brown algae almost went into a separate kingdom for a while. It was so different.
Yes, so brown is potentially very different. And it does have mobile, or some species have mobile reproductive parts.
So they the sperm and eggs are mobile and can swim through the water to find each other. But then even when they meet, often the produced baby seaweed is also a mobile thing that can swim around independently until it finds somewhere to settle. And then it'll maybe grow into something that looks nothing like the adult plant, and then it'll do a reproductive thing again to fire out new baby seaweeds, which will then grow into the adult.
Yeah, so it's all intriguing. And when things are split by phylum, they are deciding that that organism is sort of distinctly different, and sort of giving it its own phylum is saying, well, that thing that looks like the other seaweeds is, say, as different as a crab is from a mollusk. And so a brown seaweed is as significantly different from the other seaweeds and other plants to justify its own group. I think one of the problems when you're a diver or you are an amateur marine biologist is everybody gets it, or you become a generalist, and it's tough to know everything. So I guess taxonomic algal science is beyond our sort of everyday brief. We'll be very interested if we hear more about it, but at the moment that's kind of the limit of our understanding.
The only one I can remember offhand is Cutleria. Cutleria multifidita has one part of its life cycle that looks very much like Taonia. It's a big sort of shredded up, standing up brown seaweed, and the other half of its life cycle is just a splash on a rock, just a very thin crust. And that's an odd one, isn't it? And off Norfolk, we only ever see that part of the life cycle. We never see the standing up plant.
Yes, so thanks for exposing our ignorance. That's been really kind.
No, that was a really fascinating answer. Incredibly good to know that the seaweeds can exist in different parts of the ocean as different life stages. So a really informative answer and expanding my knowledge. So very grateful. Thank you.
Oh, thanks for
That's
asking.
okay.
These people are so nice.
I know. Oh, just people being nice.
Excellent. We've moved on. We've got a few chat messages in. Everybody's just being nice and not asking difficult questions. So kudos to them for letting us have a rest. Excellent. If everybody's happy, then thanks ever so much for coming along. Hope it was useful for you. We'll buzz off. We'll aim to do something next week. I'm thinking next week is probably more likely to be a dive site.
Yeah, it seems fair, because none of the other things were as desperate for people, were they?
Yeah, and we'll try to mix it up to keep people along, because I know a lot of normal people perhaps find the marine stuff a strain, and we're trying to tempt them in and trick them, and that's the way we are. Excellent. So thank you ever so much. Lovely to see you all. Hope you're all doing well. There seemed finally to be some kind of thought about when diving might reopen, just a consensus that it's not quite yet.
Mm-hmm.
And so hopefully we'll see you underwater sooner rather than later. Okay, bye-bye all.